There is a particular kind of woman that people admire without ever quite understanding her. She is the one who never complains, never raises her voice, never lets anyone see her rattled, even when the ground beneath her is shifting. People call her strong. They call her steady. They say things like, "I don't know how she does it," never once asking what it actually costs her. Caroline Ashworth was that woman. For most of her adult life, in the small, tidy town of Beaufort, South Carolina, she was known as the picture of grace under pressure. She raised 2 children while running a household on a school teacher's salary. She sat through her husband's long silences at the dinner table without complaint. She smiled through gatherings where she was talked over, corrected, and quietly dismissed. And she never once let her face show what it cost her to keep smiling. Her neighbors knew her as the woman who brought a casserole before anyone thought to ask, who remembered every birthday, who never seemed to need anything in return. At church, she was the first to volunteer and the last to complain when the volunteering went unnoticed. People trusted Caroline precisely because she never asked anything of them. She had built, without meaning to, a reputation for needing nothing at all. For 20 years, Caroline believed her silence was a form of dignity, a choice she had made, not a wound she was nursing. She told herself that women who stayed calm, who didn't make scenes, who absorbed disappointment without complaint, were the strong ones, the ones who endured. She watched other women argue with their husbands in grocery store parking lots and felt something like pity, certain she had found a better way. But there is a difference between choosing peace and disappearing quietly inside your own life. And it would take Caroline 2 decades, and a conversation she never expected, to understand which one she had actually been doing all along. That conversation was still years away, but the story of how she got there begins much earlier, in a house that taught her silence before she ever knew there was another option. Beaufort in those years was a town where everyone knew everyone, where reputations were built slowly and carefully over decades, and where a woman's composure was often the very thing that defined her worth in the eyes of her neighbors. Caroline understood this instinctively, long before she could have explained it. She understood that a woman who asked for too much, too loudly, risked becoming a subject of talk rather than admiration. And so she built her entire adult identity around never giving anyone a reason to talk. To understand how Caroline became a woman who could sit through her own erasure without a word, you have to go back to where she learned that lesson in the first place. Caroline grew up the middle child of 3, in a modest house on the outskirts of Beaufort, in a household where her mother, Ruth Calhoun, managed every emotion in the house like a thermostat that only ever pointed one direction, down. Ruth did not believe in raised voices, in disagreements aired at the table, in daughters who asked for things twice. "We don't make a fuss in this house," Ruth would say, and Caroline learned early that needs, once voiced and denied, were not to be voiced again. Ruth herself had learned this from her own mother, a woman who had raised 5 children through the hard years following the Second World War with almost nothing, and who had come to see quiet endurance as the only respectable response to hardship. It was, in its own way, a kind of inheritance, not of wealth, but of silence, passed down like a family heirloom nobody had chosen but everybody carried, generation after generation, without ever examining why. Caroline's father, Walter, worked long hours at the shipyard, and was, by most accounts, a gentle but distant man, present in body most evenings, but rarely present in any deeper sense. He did not create the household silence so much as fail to notice it, coming home to a wife who had already smoothed over whatever needed smoothing before he ever had to be part of the conversation. Caroline's older sister, Denise, rebelled against this inheritance early. By 16, Denise was already known around Beaufort as a girl who said exactly what she thought, who argued openly with Ruth at the dinner table, who eventually left for college in Charlotte and rarely came home, unwilling to live inside her mother's quiet rules for longer than a holiday visit required. Ruth called Denise difficult. Caroline privately admired her, though she never said so out loud. Caroline, gentler by nature and eager to keep the peace, absorbed the lesson instead of resisting it. She became the daughter who smoothed things over, who apologized first, even when she hadn't been wrong, who learned to read a room before she ever spoke in it. Her younger brother Thomas mostly stayed out of the household's emotional undercurrents entirely, escaping into sports and, later the military, leaving Caroline as the one who absorbed the family's unspoken tensions almost by default. There was a particular afternoon, when Caroline was 14, that she would remember for the rest of her life, without ever fully understanding why it stayed with her. She had wanted, desperately, to attend a school dance that her mother considered an unnecessary expense. She had asked once, been told no, and gone quiet. Later that same week, she overheard Ruth telling a neighbor how proud she was that Caroline never made a fuss about anything, unlike some children who nagged their parents for every little thing. Caroline remembered feeling a strange, hollow kind of pride at those words, and also something else beneath it that she didn't yet have language for. When Caroline married Daniel Ashworth at 24, in the spring of 1979, she carried that lesson into her marriage without recognizing it as a lesson at all. Daniel was not a cruel man. He was, by most measures, a good one. Steady employment at the county's public works department. Faithful, present at dinner most nights. But he was a man who had also learned, from his own upbringing, that a woman's calm was a sign that everything was fine. He never learned to ask questions beneath the surface, because Caroline never gave him a reason to. Daniel's father, Earl Ashworth, had been a quiet, hard-working man who rarely spoke about feelings. A veteran who had come home from Korea and simply gone back to work without ever discussing what he had seen or carried with him. Daniel modeled himself after his father without ever questioning whether that model served the people closest to him. He believed, sincerely, that providing was a form of love, and that a wife who wasn't complaining was a wife who was content. It did not occur to him that contentment and silence could look identical from the outside, while meaning entirely different things underneath. In the early years of their marriage, there were small moments, a birthday forgotten, an opinion dismissed in front of friends, a promotion she didn't pursue because Daniel needed her home more than she needed her own ambitions spoken aloud. Each time, Caroline felt something rise in her chest, and each time, she pushed it back down, the way her mother had taught her, and told herself it wasn't worth the disruption. There was the evening, in their third year of marriage, when Caroline mentioned an opportunity to take on more responsibility at the elementary school where she taught third grade, a step toward becoming a curriculum coordinator for the district. Daniel had responded, not unkindly but dismissively, that it sounded like a lot of extra stress for not much extra pay. Caroline had nodded, agreed it probably wasn't worth it, and never brought it up again. She did not tell him that the idea had excited her more than almost anything in years. She simply let it go, the way she had learned to let things go. She did not yet know that a habit repeated for 20 years stops being a choice. It becomes an identity. The first 10 years of Caroline and Daniel's marriage unfolded the way most marriages do, full of ordinary joys and ordinary disappointments, none of them large enough on their own to seem worth examining closely. Michael was born in 1981, and Josephine followed 3 years later. Caroline threw herself into motherhood with the same quiet diligence she brought to everything else, keeping a spotless house, volunteering at the children's school, hosting holiday dinners for both sides of the family, without ever asking Daniel to help beyond carving the turkey. Friends and family alike marveled at how effortlessly she managed it all. And Caroline, flattered by the admiration, worked even harder to make it look effortless, even on the days it very much was not. Daniel, for his part, was a present father in the ways his own father had not been. He coached Michael's Little League team for several seasons, attended school plays, took the family on modest vacations to the coast each summer. He believed, and would have said so if asked, that he was doing right by his family, and in many ways he was. But there was a particular kind of rightness that only ever looked in one direction, toward providing and participating, and never toward asking his wife what she might need beyond what she already, visibly had. It was during this decade that Caroline began, without fully realizing it, to develop what she privately thought of as her steady face, an expression she could summon regardless of what she actually felt underneath it, useful for holiday gatherings, for parent-teacher conferences, for the moments when Daniel's mother, Vivian, made a comment about Caroline's parenting choices that stung more than Caroline ever let show. Vivian Ashworth was a formidable woman who had never entirely warmed to Caroline, believing, in some unspoken way, that no woman was quite good enough for her only son. She made her opinions known in small, deniable ways, a comment about the children's manners, a remark about Caroline's cooking compared to her own, a suggestion that Caroline might consider a different approach to disciplining Michael. Daniel rarely intervened in these moments, not out of malice, but because he genuinely did not register them as significant. Caroline never told him how much they stung, so he never learned to notice. There was a particular Thanksgiving, when Josephine was 6, that Caroline would remember for years afterward. Vivian had commented in front of the entire extended family that Caroline's stuffing wasn't quite how Daniel liked it growing up, and Caroline had simply smiled, thanked her for the feedback, and quietly resolved to make Vivian's recipe the following year, swallowing whatever she had felt in that moment, so completely that by the time dinner was over, she genuinely could not have said what the feeling had been. There was another moment, smaller still, that Caroline would not consciously remember for many years, though it shaped her more than almost anything else in that decade. Daniel had come home one evening, energized about a promotion possibility within the Public Works Department, one that would mean longer hours but better pay. He talked through the decision out loud at the dinner table for nearly 20 minutes, weighing the trade-offs, asking Caroline what she thought. She told him, honestly, that she supported whatever he decided. What she did not tell him was that she had, that same week, quietly declined an invitation to lead a summer curriculum workshop for new teachers, an opportunity she had wanted badly, because she assumed that with Daniel possibly working longer hours, someone needed to be more available at home, and she had simply decided, without discussion, that the someone would be her. Daniel never knew the workshop invitation existed. Caroline never mentioned it, not out of resentment, but because raising it would have meant admitting she had wanted something enough to feel its absence, and admitting that felt, to her, indistinguishable from complaining. She told herself, that night and for years afterward, that the decision had been an easy one. It had not been easy. It had simply been quiet. By the end of that first decade, Caroline had become remarkably skilled at a particular kind of internal negotiation, noticing a slight, weighing whether raising it was worth the disruption, and almost always concluding that it was not. She did not experience this as suppression. She experienced it, sincerely, as maturity, as the kind of grace her own mother had modeled for her. She had no way of knowing, at the time, that grace and suppression could wear such similar clothing. The middle years of a marriage are where patterns either break or calcify. For Caroline and Daniel, they calcified. There was the year Michael made varsity baseball as a high school sophomore, and Daniel attended every single game, driving across 3 counties some weekends for tournaments, while Caroline, more often than not, stayed home preparing meals for family gatherings no one thanked her for, and managing Josephine's own school schedule, largely on her own. She told herself it didn't matter, that she wasn't the kind of mother who needed applause for doing what mothers did. But some nights, after the dishes were done and the house had gone quiet, she sat alone at the kitchen table for a few minutes longer than necessary, unsure what she was waiting for. There was the year Josephine, then a sophomore in high school, went through a difficult stretch with a group of friends who had begun excluding her, and came home in tears more evenings than not. Caroline handled it the way she handled everything, quietly, capably, arranging for Josephine to spend more time with her cousin, gently steering her toward new friendships, never once telling Daniel how worried she truly was, because Daniel, when told, simply suggested Josephine toughen up a little, and Caroline decided it was easier to manage the situation herself than to explain, again, why that advice missed the point entirely. There was the year Caroline's own mother, Ruth, grew ill with the first signs of the heart condition that would eventually take her, and Caroline drove 2 hours each way, 3 times a week, to help care for her, all while continuing to manage her own household without asking Daniel to adjust his schedule to help. When friends asked how she was managing it all, she smiled and said she didn't mind. She had said the same sentence so many times by then that she had nearly convinced herself it was true. Daniel was not without warmth during these years. He complimented her sometimes, thanked her for dinner, kissed her goodnight. He remembered her birthday, brought her flowers on their anniversary, and believed, sincerely, that their marriage was a good one. He never once asked her what she needed, because she never once told him there was anything to ask about. Their marriage, from the outside, looked like a peaceful one. Friends called them solid, stable, the kind of couple who'd made it work, the kind other couples pointed to as an example. What no one saw was the slow accumulation happening beneath that stability. Years of unspoken need, compounding quietly, the way interest compounds on a debt nobody is tracking, until one day, the number is simply too large to ignore. Caroline did not experience this accumulation as a single wound. She experienced it as 1,000 small, forgettable moments, each one too minor on its own to justify the disruption of speaking up. There was a particular Saturday, during Michael's junior year, when Caroline had planned a quiet weekend away with a close friend from church, the first such trip she had allowed herself in nearly a decade. 2 days before she was due to leave, Daniel mentioned that his brother would be passing through town and hoped to stay for the weekend. Caroline canceled her trip without a second thought, told her friends something had come up at home, and spent the weekend hosting her brother-in-law instead. Daniel thanked her afterward for being so accommodating, genuinely unaware that she had given anything up to make it happen. Caroline accepted the thanks graciously and never mentioned the trip again. It was around this same period that Caroline's closest friend, Patricia, gently suggested during one of their lunches that Caroline seemed to give up more than she let on. Caroline laughed the comment off, insisting she simply wasn't the type to need much. Patricia, who had known Caroline since college, didn't push the point, though she would bring it up again, more directly, many years later, after word of Caroline and Daniel's difficulties had begun to spread quietly through their circle of friends. As the children grew older, the household's rhythms shifted, but Caroline's silence remained the one constant thread running through every version of her life. When Josephine left for college at the University of South Carolina, she came home one Thanksgiving during her sophomore year and asked her mother, almost out of nowhere, why she never seemed to want anything for herself. A question Caroline deflected with a laugh, because answering it honestly would have meant admitting she had stopped tracking what she wanted years earlier. Josephine, only 19 at the time, didn't push further. She simply filed the question away, the way children often file away the things about their parents that don't quite add up, questions that resurface later, with far more weight than they carried the first time they were asked. Michael, meanwhile, had grown into a young man who called home dutifully but briefly, more comfortable talking to his father about sports and current events than sitting with his mother in any deeper conversation. Caroline noticed this without ever naming it as a loss. She told herself it was simply the nature of sons, that boys grew distant from their mothers as a matter of course, and did not examine whether her own habit of never revealing much about herself had taught Michael that there was not much to ask about. There was a particular afternoon, not long before Josephine's college graduation, when Caroline sat in her car outside the grocery store and cried for 11 minutes without knowing exactly why. She composed herself, checked her makeup in the rearview mirror, and went inside to buy what she needed for dinner. She never mentioned the 11 minutes to anyone. She barely allowed herself to remember them. Ruth's health continued to decline during these years, and Caroline took on more of her mother's care as Ruth's condition worsened, coordinating doctor's appointments, managing medications, and eventually helping arrange Ruth's move into an assisted living facility closer to Beaufort. Denise, still living in Charlotte and estranged from much of the family's day-to-day rhythms, contributed financially but rarely in person, and Caroline never once asked her sister to do more, absorbing the imbalance the same way she absorbed everything else. Vivian, Daniel's mother, passed away during this period as well, and Caroline organized the funeral, managed the extended family's various tensions during the reception, and comforted Daniel through his grief, without ever once being asked how she herself was holding up, given that her own mother's health was declining in parallel. She did not resent this, exactly. She simply noted it, quietly, the way she noted most things, and moved on to whatever needed handling next. By the time Michael left for a job in Charlotte, and Josephine had her first child, Caroline had become someone who no longer recognized the shape of her own wants. When people asked what she wanted for her birthday, she genuinely did not know how to answer, and had started asking Daniel to simply surprise her, a request he took each year with increasing literalness, until her birthday gifts had become almost entirely generic. A gift card, a nice scarf, something purchased quickly and without much thought, because he had no real information to work from and she had never given him any. Patricia raised the subject once more during this period, more bluntly than before, telling Caroline over lunch that she seemed to be disappearing a little more each year, and asking whether Caroline was truly as content as she always claimed to be. Caroline felt something flare in her chest at the question, sharper than she expected, and found herself, for once, unable to produce her usual reassurance right away. She recovered quickly, told Patricia she was simply tired from caring for her mother, and changed the subject. But she thought about the exchange for weeks afterward, turning it over at odd moments, never quite ready to sit with what it might mean. With both children gone, and Ruth now settled, more or less, in her final years, Caroline and Daniel entered the stage of marriage that many couples describe, somewhat euphemistically, as the empty nest, a phrase that implies absence, but rarely captures what actually fills the silence left behind. For Caroline and Daniel, what filled the silence was more silence. Dinners that had once been organized around the children's schedules now stretched out with long stretches of quiet, punctuated by the television or a comment about the weather. Daniel, nearing retirement from the Public Works Department, had begun spending more time at the hardware store downtown, chatting with old colleagues, while Caroline continued teaching part-time and increasingly found herself alone in a house that had once felt full. It was during this period that Caroline began, almost without noticing, to build a small life of her own around the edges of her marriage. A weekly lunch with 2 other retired teachers, a renewed interest in gardening, an online book club she never mentioned to Daniel because she suspected, correctly, that he wouldn't find it particularly interesting. These were not acts of rebellion. They were simply the small, quiet ways Caroline continued to exist as a person, separate from the marriage that had absorbed so much of her for so long. Daniel, for his part, did not notice the growing distance as distance at all. He experienced their marriage as comfortable, predictable, and, in his own estimation, happy. He would have been genuinely surprised, had anyone asked him, to learn that Caroline experienced their life together as something closer to loneliness, dressed in familiar routine. There was a trip during this period to visit Michael in Charlotte, during which Caroline noticed how easily her son spoke with his father about his career, his opinions on local politics, his plans for the future, and how carefully, by contrast, he steered conversations with her towards safe, surface-level topics: her garden, her book club, the weather back home. She did not raise this with Michael. She simply noticed it, filed it away, and told herself that sons were like that with their mothers, a story she had told herself so many times by then that repeating it required almost no effort at all. Then came the diagnosis. Ruth, now 81, was found to have advanced congestive heart failure, and the doctors were candid that her remaining time was likely measured in months rather than years. Caroline took on the bulk of her mother's final care once again, this time with the added weight of grief anticipated rather than simply managed, and once again did so largely without asking Daniel to adjust his own routines to support her through it. It was in the final weeks of her mother's life, sitting beside Ruth's hospital bed in the quiet hours of the evening, that Caroline found herself having a conversation with her mother unlike any they had ever had before. Ruth, weakened but lucid, told her daughter, almost out of nowhere, that she had spent her whole life being told that a quiet woman was a good woman, and that she wasn't sure, at the end of it, whether she believed that anymore. She told Caroline she hoped her daughter's life had been happier than her own had been. Caroline told her mother that it had been, because that was the answer Ruth needed to hear, and because, in that moment, Caroline still believed it herself. Ruth passed away 3 weeks later. Caroline organized the funeral, managed the family's various needs during the difficult days that followed, and returned to her ordinary routines within 2 weeks, telling everyone who asked that she was doing as well as could be expected. She did not yet know that her mother's words from that hospital room would return to her, with far greater force, less than a year later. Michael flew home for the funeral, staying only 2 nights before returning to Charlotte for work obligations he described as unavoidable. Caroline told him she understood completely, and meant it, though she noticed, standing in the driveway watching his rental car pull away, a small ache she did not examine too closely. Josephine, by contrast, stayed the better part of 2 weeks, quietly managing the estate paperwork alongside her mother, and it was during those 2 weeks, working side by side sorting through Ruth's belongings, that Josephine first began gently probing questions Caroline wasn't yet ready to answer, asking her mother, almost offhand, whether she'd ever wanted a different kind of life than the one she'd built in Beaufort. Caroline deflected easily at the time, and Josephine let it go, though she would return to the question again, less than a year later, in a kitchen 2 hours away. It was Josephine, now living in Colombia with her husband and their newborn daughter, who first said the word out loud. Caroline had come to stay with her daughter for a week, to help with the new baby, a common enough arrangement, and one Caroline welcomed as a chance to be useful in the particular way she had always found meaning in: caring for others, managing a household, making herself quietly indispensable. For the first 2 days, the visit unfolded exactly as expected. Caroline cooked, cleaned, rocked her granddaughter to sleep, and asked Josephine, repeatedly, what else she could do to help. On the third night, after the baby was finally asleep, Josephine sat across from her mother at the kitchen table, 2 cups of tea between them, and asked her, gently, why she had never once, in Josephine's entire childhood, asked her family for anything. Caroline started to give her usual answer, that she'd never needed much, that she was happy with a quiet life. But Josephine stopped her, shaking her head. "Mom," she said, "I used to think you were the strongest person I knew. Now I think you just never let anyone see you needed help." Those aren't the same thing. The words landed harder than Caroline expected. She sat with them for a long moment, turning them over, waiting for the familiar instinct to smooth them away, to reassure her daughter that everything had been fine. But for the first time in 20 years, the reassurance didn't come. Josephine continued, carefully, telling her mother about a memory she had carried for years, without ever mentioning it. A Christmas morning, when Caroline had opened a gift from Daniel, something impersonal and clearly last minute, and Josephine, only 12 at the time, had watched her mother's face carefully arrange itself into gratitude within seconds. "I remember thinking," Josephine said, "that I never wanted to learn how to do that, hide something that fast. But I think I did learn it, from you." Josephine went on to describe other memories: the Thanksgiving with Vivian's comment about the stuffing, a birthday where Caroline had clearly been disappointed but insisted everything was wonderful, the way Caroline had never once, in Josephine's memory, asked Daniel to change his plans to accommodate something Caroline wanted. "I always thought that was strength," Josephine said quietly. "Now I wonder how much of yourself you gave up to make it look that easy." Instead of her usual reassurance, something else came, a memory of every dinner she'd sat through swallowing a comment, every ambition she'd folded quietly away, every time Daniel had looked past her instead of at her, and she had said nothing, because saying something had never once felt safe. Caroline realized, sitting in her daughter's kitchen at nearly midnight, that her silence had not protected her marriage. It had simply protected everyone else from ever having to reckon with her. She thought of Michael, too, grown now, and living 3 states away, calling home dutifully every Sunday, but never staying on the phone for more than 10 minutes. She wondered for the first time whether her son had learned the same lesson her daughter had, that his mother was someone to check in on, not someone to actually know. She thought of her own mother, Ruth, in that hospital room, wondering aloud whether a lifetime of quiet had actually made her happy. She thought of Ruth's mother before her, and the quiet she had passed down as though it were a virtue rather than a wound. Caroline understood, sitting at her daughter's kitchen table, that she had been one link in a much longer chain, and that if she did nothing now, she would hand that same chain to Josephine, who was already, in small ways, beginning to notice its weight. Josephine, watching her mother's face change over the course of that conversation, reached across the table and took her hand, something she hadn't done since she was a child. "I'm not trying to hurt you," she said softly. "I just don't want my daughter learning what I learned. And I think the only way that doesn't happen is if you and I talk about it now, honestly, instead of pretending everything was fine." Caroline nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and then, haltingly, began to talk. Really talk, for the first time in longer than she could remember, about what those 30 years had actually felt like from the inside. The cost had never been abstract. It had a shape. It looked like a husband who didn't know his wife's real opinions after 30-plus years of marriage. It looked like children who loved a version of their mother built entirely out of what she never said. It looked like a woman standing in her own kitchen, in her own life, feeling like a guest in both. Caroline did not sleep much that night. She lay awake in her daughter's guest room, listening to the faint sound of the baby monitor down the hall, running through decades of moments she had never once allowed herself to properly feel, now arriving all at once, decades late and impossible to ignore. The drive back to Beaufort took just under 2 hours, and Caroline spent most of it in a silence, very different from the one she had practiced for most of her adult life. Not the silence of accommodation, but the silence of a woman thinking harder than she had allowed herself to think in years. She thought about the department head position she had never mentioned wanting, more than 30 years earlier. She thought about the 11 minutes in the grocery store parking lot. She thought about every Thanksgiving, every birthday, every ordinary Tuesday evening when something small had gone unspoken, because speaking it had never once felt worth the disruption. She found herself, somewhere around the halfway point of the drive, angry in a way she did not have much practice being, and she did not entirely know what to do with the feeling, other than let it sit in the car beside her for the remaining hour. She thought, too, about what she actually wanted now, at 56 years old, and found the question nearly as difficult to answer as it would have been 20 years earlier. She knew she wanted Daniel to understand what she had just begun to understand herself. She knew she wanted her children to know her as more than a source of quiet, reliable comfort. Beyond that, she realized with a small jolt that she genuinely did not know what else she wanted, because she had spent so long not asking the question that the muscle required to answer it had atrophied from disuse. By the time she pulled into the driveway of the house she had lived in for over 3 decades, Caroline had made a decision, though she could not yet have said exactly what shape it would take. She knew only that she could not walk back into the house and resume her old pattern, not after the previous 3 days, not after finally hearing, out loud, from her own daughter, the cost that pattern had extracted without her ever quite noticing it happening. She sat in the driveway for several minutes before going inside, the engine off, the house dark except for the porch light Daniel always left on for her. She thought of Patricia's question from years earlier, the one about disappearing a little more each year, and realized, sitting there, that she finally had an honest answer to it. She was not content. She had been quiet. For most of her life she had allowed the two to look identical, both to herself and to everyone around her, and she understood now that the difference between them was the entire story. Caroline went home, and for the first time in her marriage, she did not walk back into her old pattern. It did not happen all at once, and it was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed door, no ultimatum. It happened instead over a quiet dinner, 2 days after her return, when Daniel made an offhand comment about her cooking being different than his mother's used to be, the kind of comment Caroline would have swallowed without a flicker for 30 years. This time, she put her fork down. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to actually hear it." Daniel looked up, startled by the seriousness in her voice, and Caroline told him, haltingly, imperfectly, but honestly, about the years of small dismissals she had absorbed without a word, about the ambitions she had folded away, about the loneliness of being married to a man who had never once had to ask what she was feeling, because she had never let it show. She told him about the curriculum coordinator position she had never mentioned wanting, more than 30 years earlier. She told him about the 11 minutes in the grocery store parking lot. She told him about Christmas mornings and holiday comments from his mother that had stung far more than she ever let on, and the particular exhaustion of being the only person in the house whose feelings were never asked after. Daniel sat mostly silent through it, his expression shifting between confusion and something closer to alarm, as though he were meeting, for the first time, a woman he had been married to for over 3 decades. Daniel did not respond well at first. He grew defensive, listing all the ways he believed he had provided for her, protected her, been faithful to her, as though her silence had been a complaint about his character, rather than a description of a pattern they had both, in different ways, participated in building. Caroline let him finish, then said quietly that she wasn't accusing him of failing her. She was telling him she had failed herself, and that she needed him to understand why, so it wouldn't continue, and so their children didn't inherit the same quiet cost she had carried for so long. The days that followed were not easy. Daniel withdrew for a time, uncertain how to process what he was hearing, occasionally slipping into old defensiveness before catching himself. There was one difficult evening when he asked her, not unkindly, why she had waited 30 years to say any of this, and Caroline, for the first time, allowed herself to answer honestly rather than protectively. "Because I didn't think I was allowed to," she told him. "And because somewhere along the way, I stopped believing there was anything underneath the silence worth saying." Slowly, something began to shift. Daniel came back to her, days later, with something Caroline had never once heard from him in over 3 decades of marriage, an apology that named specific things, rather than a general acknowledgement meant to smooth things over quickly. He told her he remembered the curriculum coordinator conversation, that he hadn't understood, at the time, what he was dismissing. He told her he wanted to learn how to ask better questions, even if he wasn't sure yet what that would look like in practice. They began, in small and sometimes clumsy ways, to build a different pattern. Daniel started asking Caroline directly what she wanted, rather than assuming her silence meant contentment. Caroline, for her part, practiced answering honestly, even when honesty felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable, even when her first instinct remained, as it likely always would to some degree, to say she was fine. There were setbacks. Old habits resurfaced more than once, a silence that crept back in before Caroline caught herself and spoke instead, a dismissive comment from Daniel that took him days to recognize and address. But something had shifted permanently. Caroline had learned, far later than she would have liked, that speaking her needs out loud was not a disruption of peace. It was the foundation peace should have been built on all along. She also began, gently, to speak with Josephine and Michael differently, telling Josephine, in a long phone call one evening, how much that night in the kitchen had changed her, and thanking her daughter for saying something Caroline herself had never had the courage to say to her own mother while there was still time. She began, too, calling Michael more often, asking him real questions about his life, rather than settling for the easy, surface-level exchanges they had both grown used to, and found, to her quiet surprise, that he began answering them. One Sunday call, several months into this new pattern, Michael grew quiet on the other end of the line, after Caroline asked him, plainly, whether he was truly happy in Charlotte, or simply telling her what he thought she wanted to hear. There was a long pause before he admitted, for the first time in years, that he'd been considering a career change he hadn't mentioned to anyone, uncertain how his father would react. Caroline listened, asked questions, and did not once tell him what he should do. It was a small conversation, ordinary by most standards, but it was the first time in a long while that her son had told her something true rather than simply comfortable, and Caroline understood it as a sign that the new pattern was taking root beyond just her marriage. We often mistake a woman's silence for her strength, because it is easier to admire someone's composure than to ask what it is protecting. But strength that requires a person to disappear is not strength at all. It is survival, dressed up in a calmer name. Caroline Ashworth spent decades believing her silence was a gift she gave her family, a peace she had chosen. It took her daughter's honesty, a night in a kitchen in Columbia, and a 2-hour drive home to Beaufort, for her to finally understand that peace, built on one person's unspoken needs, is not peace. It is simply a debt that someone else is always the one paying, until, one day, they stop being willing to pay it quietly. Caroline is still by nature a calm woman. That much never changed. But there is a difference now between her calm and her old silence. The difference between choosing not to speak and being unable to. Daniel still has moments where old habits surface, and Caroline still has moments where the instinct to swallow something whole returns before she catches it. But increasingly, she catches it, and increasingly she speaks. She often thinks back to her mother, Ruth, in that hospital room, wondering aloud whether a lifetime of quiet had made her happy. Caroline wishes she had asked her mother more questions in that moment. She wishes she had told her, honestly, that she wasn't sure the answer was yes for either of them. But she carries that unfinished conversation forward now in the way she speaks with her own daughter, determined that the chain of inherited silence stop, if not with her, then with the next generation, who might learn something different by watching her try. Patricia noticed the change before almost anyone else did. Over lunch one afternoon, nearly a year after that night in Josephine's kitchen, she told Caroline, with something like relief in her voice that she finally sounded like herself. Not the composed, unbothered version Caroline had presented for decades, but someone with actual opinions, actual frustrations, actual wants she was willing to name out loud. Caroline laughed and admitted it had taken her most of a lifetime to get there. Patricia squeezed her hand and told her it wasn't too late, which was, Caroline realized, exactly what she needed to hear. Daniel, for his part, has never become a man who intuitively knows what his wife is feeling without being told. That was never realistic, and Caroline no longer expects it of him. What has changed is that he asks now, regularly and sincerely, and Caroline has learned to answer honestly, even when the honest answer is more complicated than the easy one. Their marriage today is not the peaceful, frictionless thing it once appeared to be from the outside. It is something quieter in a different way, steadier, more honest, built on actual knowledge of each other rather than the comfortable assumptions that had stood in for knowledge for 30 years. If there is a woman in your life who has never once asked for anything, who is always calm, always accommodating, always fine, it may be worth asking her, gently, what her silence has actually cost her. She may not know how to answer right away. She may deflect, the way Caroline once did, with a smile and a reassurance that everything is fine. But the asking, alone, is sometimes the first thing that lets her start finding the words. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from.